Hey there. Hello and welcome to this another Ukraine update of the day 133. I think this is a good point. I wanted to make a video last week, but kind of the situation was developing. And again, I'm not really in favor of making those everyday tactical video discussions. And I want to use today as to discuss what's the situation around Ukraine, around the war, and most importantly, talk to the people that asked me to help this and explain the situation in Ukraine and what's the potential for the future. And obviously, the big news that everyone I think is aware of is Ukrainians have pulled out of Lysychansk and they are straightening their defense lines, which is exactly as was expected and exactly as the military experts that I'm listening to have predicted. The withdrawal from Lysychansk was very orderly, and the Ukrainians have basically been executing their own plan and their own tactics very nicely. And most of the experts that I'm listening to are very optimistic about the situation and the developments that were happening around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. And despite, don't get me wrong, Russians are still in pro-Russian, like the channels and bloggers and propagandists are claiming this is a major victory. Obviously, the experts are saying what I've been saying in pretty much every my video, that this does not matter. It's just it's just a little bit of a territory, and it's minuscule in the scale. So where are we now in this day 133 of the war? And today's discussion I want to break down in two big segments. One is going to be focusing around Ukraine, and then the second one is focusing around Russia. So, the situation around Ukraine. Firstly, let's dive into about Ukrainian side. I mean, like the Ukrainian war side to this conflict. So, why are the experts that I'm listening to optimistic? Firstly, we need to understand what was happening in Ukraine's army in the past months, and that is, for example, what was happening very intensively, like a month and a half to 2 months ago, about 50 to 30 days before the situation, is that Ukrainian army was pretty much out of ammo. Like their older Soviet weapons that they had were either completely worn off and or did not have actually the ammo to shoot. So it was getting into some kind of ludicrous amounts. Right now, finally, some data is coming in from that period, and it's actually a joke. It's basically to every 2,000 or so shots fired by the Russians, it was around like 100 shots fired by the Ukrainians. So it's ludicrous comparison, right? So any kind of a combat. The fact that Ukraine was able to execute their plan at all with that kind of suppression is actually surprising. So what was the plan of Ukraine? Because with actually the completion of the Lysychansk offensive, we see already the end of this kind of second stage of the war coming to an end. I know we've been coming and discussing that it's coming closely, but we now already see the end of it literally right around the corner, and it's actually quite close to what was predicted, that by the middle of the summer to the end of the summer, the Russian offensive will be completely stopped. And it looks like that it's well on track to be exactly where it's at least that's what the experts are saying. The two major things that Russia can do to change it: one is start deploying nuclear weapons, which obviously is going to change the whole war situation and the political situation around the war very fast. And it's a whole bag of worms. We can just basically, if the nukes are used, we can scrap whatever outlines were there, and it's going to be a completely new situation, not favorable for Russia. And then the second option that they can do is obviously the full mobilization of their population. This is something that Russians still can do, and this will not technically change the ongoing ongoings of the war. So it will prolong it, and it will completely change the situation in a way that the political internal context within the Russia, because the it's going to change very much significantly, because it's going to be an open declaration essentially of war finally, at least for the internal population, because as I explained in my longer video, is that Russia is this pretend state where they are lying to everyone outside Russia and actually to themselves about everything, and that they are the heroes of this story, that they are actually very not much of a protagonist, that they are actually not in a state of war, that it's a special military operation as against the Nazis. When the global mobilization is essentially declared, that is basically a full confirmation of the full-scale war. So there's a lot of political aspects around that, but I'm not gonna predict. I haven't followed any kind of political experts on the subject, and to be honest, Russian political experts have been wrong for the most part. So I tend not to look at those. So when someone says like, oh, the close like oligarchs around Putin is going to overthrow him, I completely dismiss those kind of objects. So I look more about the actual strength of Ukrainians to compare to the strength of the Russians and what the actual military experts are saying rather than the political ones, because I don't really count on the Russian political elite to crumble. But let's talk about the taking of the Lysychansk. So we know that Lysychansk and Severodonetsk were major defense lines. So there was a defense line here essentially, and we had the line here. So to review, around 2 months ago, and this is, as I explained, this is where the Ukraine was really having shortage of ammunition. The push came through Popasna. So this is where Ukrainians essentially lost Popasna, and I'm going to talk about Popasna a little bit more and why it was really, really tough to hold it. But this is basically where the pocket around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk starting to get closed, because then the Russians are started to push in, and Ukrainians didn't have the firepower to hold them at bay despite their best efforts. Since then, the Russians have been pushing out and trying to close down this pocket. We saw the great Ukrainian command. As I explained, Ukrainians have this weird, either Soviet style or post-Soviet, and this heroic complex that they want to defend their major outposts to the last man. And it resulted in the Ilovaisk tragedy. It resulted in the Debaltsevo tragedy. So you can read out on those, and those were major defeats in the Ukrainian army in 2014 because of the old styled command structure that they had in Ukrainian army. The fact that they had this pocket that was seemingly closing around Zoloto, the Ukrainians pulled out, and then the pocket started closing on Lysychansk, and Ukrainians pulled out again. And it was done very organized. The people that I have on the front lines that I know of are reporting, and they say it was very good. I mean, obviously it's been bloody and we're shooting, and obviously it's war. Like every time I'm talking and I say, well, right now there is a pause in the combat, when you go, for example, at the actual front lines, it's still shooting every day, and the war never stops. It's only nice and comfortable for me to talk about it because I'm sitting in a nice warm apartment on a comfy chair. But the war is going on every day. But if we're talking a little bit of a higher level and how this whole situation is going to continue, then we can say that what Ukrainian is doing is amazingly good, because they are both slowing down Russian advance, they are killing the Russian army, they're grinding them down slowly and surely. So they're doing exactly what the defender should do in their position. And the fact that they were able to hold without having significant firepower is really nice. So Russian pincer attacks that they've tried to execute, and we know that this is exactly how Russian army operates because we've seen this time and time again since 2014, is not working, and Ukrainians are happily give up territory to preserve their troops. And that's why military analysts are saying that this is a very important shift of a paradigm in Ukrainian military, and this shows that Ukrainian army is actually being controlled. So it's like it's not just the warriors with the flaming hearts that are defending the country. They're actually executing army maneuvers and they're executing army control, which is good in the scale of the offensive. So despite the media and everyone else hyping up that, oh my god, the Russians have taken Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, it is actually not a big deal because this is just territory. Territory can be regained. It has happened in pretty much every war. You can just look. The territory goes here and there. It's very much not always not common that the territory just being taken and then that's it. So I mean, at least when we're talking about equal powers fighting, when it's like a U.S. fighting against some lesser state, then probably not as much. But importantly, what has changed right now for Ukrainians is there has been this very interesting, like a sandbox playground for a lot of the US and Western weapons in Ukraine. Because if you notice that a lot of the first weapon packages have sent very large nomenclature and like lists of different kinds of weapons. And because actually what was happening is that the West didn't really know what kind of weapons would be effective. And we know that the West is also slow to change to adaptive situation because they got the first weapons effective when the Ukrainians were fighting first part of the war, when the drones and anti-tank weapons were king. And then they shifted to the second part of the war where suddenly it's a completely different war and now the artillery is king. And it took obviously months for West to adapt to this new style of combat that Ukraine is fighting. And now so they sent different kinds of weapons and they looked at what works. One of the interesting weapons that a lot of the actually analysts were prospecting to be really effective was the kamikaze drones or barrage ammunitions. And it actually didn't turn out to be so, because what turns out to be is that the Russian equipment that blocks like radio waves and anti-drone weapons are actually quite advanced, and they are effectively blocking the usage of a lot of those drones. So when you watch videos about, like, I recently got video popped up to me on like Facebook. Yes, I'm that old, I'm still using Facebook. And the video popped up to me where there's like a drone swarm flying in, destroying a tank column. Amazing 3D graphics, whatever. Completely useless because there is some kind of a radio jamming station nearby that just jams all the drones in a large area, and they miss the targets because they think the target is one place, but it's actually already is not there, and they just hit the ground. So those things, despite the prospects, turned out to be not as effective. However, as we kind of developed, we found out what things were effective. It's the long-range artillery. And the fact that it's finally becoming clear that these weapons are becoming effective, that the West can now focus on getting those weapons in. And for example, Stingers, they also became super effective. The Russian aviation has stopped flying into the actual Ukrainian territory. Most of the time, Russian aviation is flying max like to the contact line with the Ukrainians and then no further. So that is very major defense. And also another thing that Western allies found out to be very effective is radar stations. Like Ukrainians are employing radar stations quite heavily and with great success. Like their anti-artillery, anti-batteries, and anti-artillery location, counter-battery fire, I think it was called, is extremely good because of that radar stations that is been provided from the West. So we see that both the West is learning what kind of weapons Ukraine need, And Ukraine is learning what kind of weapons are really effective against Russian army, because it was not as clear from the outset. And especially we talked around the fact that a lot of the more advanced weapons that the West has requires a lot of training. For example, the HIMARS or the like long range artillery systems required like a couple of weeks of training, and now they're finally complete and they're being delivered, and they're extremely effective. But I'm going to talk about it just a bit later. So what's out there for the future? Well, it's good. Like the future, despite the whole situation with taking Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, might look on the tactical level, hey, that's a defeat for Ukrainians. I argue that it's not, and a lot of analysts are saying that it's not, because Ukraine is continuing successfully to do what the defender should do, is to slow down the attacker and grind down their forces, to inflict casualties on the forces. And this is exactly what they're doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how much they're slowing down Russians just a bit later. But the point is that we need to understand that there has been very good signs of Ukrainians. We know that there has been a lot of the armories hit in the back line of the Russians, so they're going to have troubles. So some of the weapons are going to be more effective. The West has found what kind of weapons are effective. So now Ukraine is going to start receiving more focused shipments of weapons that are actually making change on the battlefield. And more importantly, the West, we didn't have stockpiles of a lot of those weapons prepared. We weren't in a Cold War situation. So a lot of those weapons needed to be produced. And I said in the last update that a lot of the factories are now starting to produce weapons for Ukraine. And it's indeed starting. And a lot of allies are doing it. For example, Czechia and Romania have said that they will both repair Ukrainian old Soviet equipment that got damaged. Romania especially said that they will also produce ammo for 152. It's a Soviet-style artillery munition, so the ones that Ukraine is using. So Romania is going to start making those old caliber ammunition that is relevant for Ukraine. So it's very good. The West is, and a lot of Western, like obviously the US is the primary one, but a lot of the other, even Eastern European allies are helping Ukraine a lot, and they're, despite by themselves, maybe each country separately is not a big deal, but when they're working all together, it does make a change. So importantly, what we see with these weapons changes and situation delivery and a situation outlook, like a lot of the people on the front lines are now reporting that around, for example, Bakhmut, it's here, and Sloviansk, it's here, Ukrainian aviation started appearing, right? So that means that something is hitting Russian anti-air systems, anti-air radars in their territory. So Ukrainian aviation is confident enough to fly in. I'll remind you that Ukrainian aviation was not on these front lines of this direction at any moment before that. So that is a big deal. That shows that something is happening. And training is already starting at Great Britain for the Ukrainian army. And I'm sure that other allies are going to help Ukraine with that as well. So the future, despite the situation kind of looking somewhat dark, because no one likes losing territory in cities and so on. But when you look past the general political outlook about the fact that yes, the cities have been taken and so on, then it becomes clear that as a part of this operation, because defending those cities was kind of hard, they were kind of in a pocket from the outset. But right now, it's not as clear cut for where Russians should go and where they should attack, and we see that the tides are changing. So let's talk about the Russian offensive, and why is it that Russians are going to have hard times? Well, the first thing that I need to understand, and to understand just, wow, Russia is winning this war. They're going to take over next cities and then they're going to take over Ukraine. This is something that's in the news recently. I've seen it, I think, either Sky News or Euronews or something. It's like, oh, the Russians are going to take all over Ukraine right now because they took Lysychansk. That's it. That Ukraine is almost done. It's it's stupid. So let's talk about how much Russia has really achieved. So let's take the last 90 days. So in the last 90 days, in the most advanced direction, the full-blown offensive of the whole Russian military has advanced about 50 kilometers. That is ludicrously small amount. 50 kilometers, to put it in a perspective, means that the whole Russian machine is advancing about 500 meters a day. 500 meters a day is not a lot. And that's only those directions where like the most firepower was concentrated. And again, a lot of it was concentrated about with the 100 shots that Ukrainians make to 2,000 shots that Russians make. So it's with this huge suppression of the Ukrainian military, they were still able to advance only 50 kilometers in those 90 days. To put a perspective on this, how much it is, so from the next city that supposedly Russians should capture, like from Sloviansk, right? It's right here. I'm just gonna show here. It's Sloviansk to the city of Dnipro, which is here. That's the kind of the next big city. Well, if you don't count Pavlograd, which is here, let's not count it for this city. But from here to here, so if Russians would capture Sloviansk, this is 175 kilometers. With advancing army of 500 meters a day, 175 kilometers turns to 350 day. That is a year. And it's 175, that's obviously a direct line. So a year. So if the Russians, and I'm obviously ceteris paribus, all things equal, if Russians are advancing 175 kilometers for 1 year, as an example, something for Europeans to align, it's a distance from the outskirts of Amsterdam to the outskirts of Brussels. It's a distance that can be covered by a car in a 1 hour and 45 minutes ride. So 1 hour and 45 minutes ride in a car, the Russian army is going to cover in a year. And Ukraine is maybe 3 times as large, if not 4 times that large. Sorry, wrong button. This is nowhere near. It's a disaster. All the military analysts are saying that this kind of advanced tempo, it's not realistic. It is like a lot of the pro-Russian bloggers and propagandists saying, yeah, Russian military is slowly grinding slowly grinding down the Ukrainian defense. No, they're not. No, they're not. They are the attacking army. They're supposed to break down the defense. They're supposed to kill everyone and just advance fast and take land and so on. Advancing 500 meters a day is literally standing in place in the terms of the military. At least that's what the experts are saying, and I'm just parroting those words. So that is how bad the Russian military is doing. They are losing a lot of men. They are losing a lot of equipment. Despite the Russian stocks being huge, they're not infinite. And their production capacity is not good enough. And they're having trouble with their neighbors. I'm not sure if you heard, but they have now essentially in a trade war with Kazakhstan, one of their biggest allies. This is not something that anyone was expecting because of some political discussions. So the offensive potential of the Russians is very, 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 very small. And Ukrainian potential, we already see by describing that, well, there are really now air support appearing on the front lines. So that means that there is a big problem. And the problem for the Russian military essentially comes down to the way the Russian military fights. So they wanted to do this kind of a blitzkrieg at the first phase of the operation, and we know how it turned out. We saw the complete shittiness of the Russian logistics system and the way that they completely don't know how to organize their operations on the ground level. They cannot sustain proper logistics network, and they don't have the capabilities because their army is incompetent. This is what we saw, and I know that they cannot really properly fight as a huge scale military campaign. Don't get me wrong. Maybe there is units that obviously know what they're doing, but what we saw is that their logistics are complete shit, and logistics haven't improved. What did change for the Russians in the stage 2, and we see here, is the screenshot of Popasna village. So the red dots is a completely destroyed house, and the yellow dot is a semi-destroyed house. This is what they're doing. This is how the Russians are fighting. They've done it in Syria, they've done it in everywhere, in other places that they fought. This is the fire suppression. So they're basically destroying everything that is before them. They're destroying and leveling all the cities to the ground. They are completely leveling the city, and then they're coming into that territory when the defenders just say, like, there is nothing to defend here anymore. The problem with this effort is, and what they would do is they would stockpile huge stockpiles of ammunition to support that kind of artillery right close by, and then the logistical network would be basically just trucks driving back and forth for the whole day for the, I don't know, like 10, 15, 20 kilometers to the firing positions of the artillery. The problem for Russians is something that's appeared as a HIMARS problem. So we know that Ukrainians finally got the long-range artillery that is HIMARS, that is M270. And the past couple of days have been basically a stream of videos of Russian huge ammo dumps being completely destroyed. And it's already coming to bite Russians in the ass. What Ukrainians have reported from the front lines is that they are noticing that on the front lines, in the major corners, after some facility has been hit by the long-range artillery, the Russian artillery does not respond because they literally have no ammo. They literally cannot supply enough ammunition. So with the long-range artillery now in play, the Russians are now forced to essentially set up these kind of supply lines again about 100 kilometers away from their front line. And to remind you, 100 kilometers away was about the extension from the border of Russia where they had the bases to Kyiv area. So the situation with HIMARS and the problem with HIMARS that Russia are going to have is that their logistical network and their logistical operations basically are forced right now to repeat the Kyiv operation. And that is a huge issue because the logistics of Russians haven't improved. What they did is they just did the dumbest shit possible, the dumbest way you can fight in a war with the Russian. You just have 20 times the advantage of firepower against your enemy, and then you just level everything before you, and then you just move into the completely destroyed ground and completely destroyed villages and just say claim victory. With no firepower and poor logistics network that have to drive 100 kilometers in one single truck, maybe it's 1 or 2 rides per day, it leaves Russian front line with no chance to fight. And we already know that the quality of the troops that Russians have is not really that good. So a complex military operations is not something that Russian troops during the last days have been demonstrating to the ability to execute. So this creates a very, very, very dark future for the Russian army in their potential to advance. So those two things combined with the Ukrainians are getting the capabilities they need, and Russians completely losing the ability, well, not yet completely. They're still like the HIMARS systems are just few. So there's not enough to support the entire front line. But overall, having any kind of like long-term advance potential is basically a tragedy for the Russian offensive that is already in the air. And right now, the only like in the West, there is so much that is happening on the news where the reporters and everyone else are just yelling, "Oh, the Russia is going to take the whole of Ukraine." It's complete dog shit. You listen to the military experts that actually evaluate the war and it's going and so on, and then you see, well, yeah, Russia is losing its capability to advance, and they've been advancing so far with their overwhelming might of 500 meters per day. It's a disaster. It's a complete disaster for their potential offensive. We're going to see how the Ukrainian offensive will go once they're going to start. We're probably going to see soon enough, maybe by the end of summer, getting into this positional warfare where there's not going to be a lot of movement. And after that, Ukraine will increase its tempo of essentially stockpiling the weapons for the offensive. And this will essentially, we started seeing, like, it's right now, it's completely obvious that there is going to be a very dark days ahead for the Russian military operation, special military operation, as they like to call it. And yeah, so don't think that losing a couple of cities is worth it. I even can tell you more. The Russians might even take Sloviansk or Kramatorsk or Konstantinovka, like all of these cities. All of this can be taken. It still doesn't changes anything. It still doesn't changes. It still is not enough for the Russians, like, because the Russian ultimate goal is to win Ukraine, like to defeat, but they're not even close to defeating Ukraine. The fact that they're taking land and the fact that we see Ukraine is okay with Russians taking land if they can save people and then fight another day, that means only one thing, that the Russians are very much doomed because they don't have the capability to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. And that's the good news.